Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank each one of you for joining us this afternoon for the technical session titled Building Resilience of Microfinance Clients, Innovations and Best Practices in Times of Pandemic. It is my pleasure to invite the esteemed panel for the session. This session is co-curated in partnership with Sadhan. This session shall be moderated by Deepti George, Deputy Executive Director, Dwara Research, and the panelists include Vivek Tiwari, MD and CEO, Satyas Microfin, Shashidhar T, CEO, Sub-K, and Deeptarang Dev, National Manager, Family Banking and Microbanking, Ujjivan SFB. We look forward to an insightful discussion, and with this, I would like to hand over the charge of the session to Ms. Deepti George. Deepti, you have the floor.
Thanks, Nosha, and hello everybody to this panel. So as the topic reveals, we know that each of our lived experiences of the pandemic has a very personal element to it, and so is the case with lives for low-income and poor households. It has, in some sense, unleashed devastation of livelihoods among all kinds of other issues, and for low-income households, and this has significant implications for providers who serve them. And I'm hoping that through this panel discussion, we get to understand and share experiences of the lived experiences of such providers. I think the pandemic itself has brought to sharp focus the trials and tribulations of financial services providers in the manner in which, particularly those with last mile capabilities, in the manner in which they have had to really let go of past constraints and think quickly, deeply, and fast in order to respond and survive through the pandemic. And the hope is that today we get to deliberate how one large part of the provider universe in India, which is microfinance, and other specialized sort of last mile providers responded to the pandemic, how they built resilience for the bottom of the pyramid beneficiaries through product development, diversified product offering, data-led decision making, simplified processes, new channels, and other initiatives. So this session will attempt to identify, hopefully we'll identify several innovative practices which were brought into play by various supply side participants. As you will see, there is a good mix of participants here on this panel, but I have been asked to kind of speak for about just 5 to 10 minutes about what were the international insights and best practices. So I'll do that first, but before that, there is a quick poll that the IFI organizers have put together. It'll be great if we could run the poll now, and then we can have the results perhaps just before the panel starts. So if I may request, Anusha, if the poll questions could be projected so participants could respond on that.
Yes, just give us a sec. We'll do it. Okay, Deepti, I think we're having a technical glitch. Can you just do the presentation and then we'll come back to the poll? Is that okay?
Sounds good. Okay. All right, so I'll quickly move to what were the international experiences and sort of insights that we could garner from lived experiences of financial institutions through the pandemic. So the Indian case. So let me just talk about India, then we'll see what were there to be documented in other jurisdictions, right? Sorry, just a second. Yeah. So, I mean, just as, in India, we know that a whole bunch of experiences were there through the pandemic. Almost all entities were impacted, unlike many other earlier local or mini crises that in some sense microfinance has gotten used to, and we've had national as well as localized and often citizen-led lockdowns when it comes to that have significant impact on access to really physically accessing customers in order to make disbursements as well as collections. in the early days, branches had to be closed overnight, often with significant amount of cash. This meant significant disruptions to operations. The regulatory response, of course, which spanned across so many months, further confounded certain issues, although those were significantly required, right? So flaws in MISs, LMSs kind of turned up as an observation. So, for example, loans were auto-classified as substandard when they were unpaid, but any demand for a specific loan couldn't be set at zero. So entities, with advanced CBSs or LMSs were able to deal with it better, but they're not the case for everybody. Similar issues were observed in regard to auto-reporting to credit bureaus. Also, that our observation, that if an account was restructured, then the Microfinance Bureau invariably didn't capture that incident. Unlike banking credit bureaus, banking sector bureaus. Thankfully, this was rectified. There was also, coming toward the larger question of liquidity crisis, many MFIs, since they had to offer the moratorium that the government had declared, while they were also at the creditors' mercies about when they were going to receive moratorium, their own kind of debt liabilities. So, of course, forbearance from the regulator in terms of asset quality freeze, that will help in the short run, but in the long term, the implications are unclear. And the fiscal relief was simply inadequate. The qualifying criteria for A rating, and that was a requirement for some of the schemes that were announced. And the size of the package itself was fairly small, which meant that only some of the larger, better rated entities could have access to it. So in this background, I just wanted to also mention that there is a particular initiative called the Sentinel Project, hosted by New York University's Financial Access Initiative. A primary researcher is Timothy Ogden. They're trying to document the sort of in an anonymized manner across 7+ countries and across 12+ microfinance institutions, document the lived realities of how entities brave through the pandemic. And these are very much in a case study style approach, and I would urge participants who are interested to actually take a look at some of the written outputs, materials that they have put together in terms of what are trends that are seen, and commonalities and differences that were seen across jurisdictions. And so Dwara was in fact leading the India kind of documentation. And so a lot of the insights that I share here actually come from what we experienced there. Sorry. Okay. So when it comes to international insights, I think all jurisdictions, there were lockdowns, mostly at localized levels. In some cases, national lockdowns were also seen, and this had tremendous impact on collections, which is similar to India. And there was also some form of moratorium or restructuring of some form. There was a jurisdiction in Africa that offered a 12-month moratorium, and in addition to this, consumer-facing. So these were really consumer-facing, but regulators also reduced provisioning requirements for loans which are turning delinquent because of stress induced by COVID-19. In many cases, MFIs had liquidity shortfall, very similar to what we saw in India. And many MFIs across jurisdictions did fail. In one Asian jurisdiction, there was a new guarantee fund which was set up to guarantee all MFI loans restructured due to COVID. And there was another jurisdiction where government applied what's called a turnover tax, that all entities, even if they did not make profits, still had to pay this tax, right? And the Indian response, more or less, we would argue, is situated somewhere in the middle ground. So though the operating environment was similar, the lived experiences of MFIs differed greatly. Some MFIs were at a better liquidity position compared to others, because either they had a large deal, or they had a large bond issuance, or raised equity just prior to the pandemic, or in the early stages of the pandemic. The digital transformation itself was underway in many jurisdictions, and so it was just so much more easier to get onto that when the pandemic hit. Liquidity crisis was almost seen in almost all cases, barring pockets of where there was excess liquidity. All sort of major international microfinance investment vehicles and DFIs were willing to extend support. There were some leaders even commenting that it appeared that these types of support, these types of entities like DFIs and MIVs appeared to be over liquid, right? Anyway, so that's one observation. Just a few more insights. So despite the expectation that cash flows of borrowers will be stressed and disbursement will be negligible. At least this wasn't, they were actually, so while repayments were also coming, there were also new loan categories and new kinds of loans which were being offered by entities. Some kind of MFIs across jurisdictions offered consumption loans, which were deemed as emergency loans, right, for consumers. Despite knowing that, many cases borrower cash flows were strapped and they were highly restricted. There were new loan categories, such as in an Asian jurisdiction where the demand for health insurance jumped, and so there was an MFI that introduced a new product that would pay the insurance premium, and then which the borrower must repay. Although we see new categories were emerging, consumption smoothing loans were being openly disbursed, and the loans with weekly or fortnightly repayment frequency were much more regularly repaid than ones which had a monthly, very much similar to the microfinance experience pre-pandemic. The quantum of deals, right, when it comes to investment vehicles or DFIs, again, just the sheer sort of size per deal also increased significantly. For MIVs were offering sort of 2 to 3 million euro per single deal. They were starting to offer like up to like 10 million euros. For DFIs, again, 5 to 7 million euro, but none jumped to like 8 to 12 million euros across these jurisdictions. So there was a general sense that such funders were over liquid. Now, since all jurisdictions were allowed lower provisioning, the impacts of these on capital position for MFIs remains unknown. I think raising debt was comparatively much easier than raising equity capital, but we'll come to know what the experiences of our panelists have been. In almost all jurisdictions, it was very difficult to raise fresh equity. And, there was too much variation in the expectation and the loss appetite from existing and prospective equity holders, right? So it wasn't very clear. There's also the emergence of this paradigm of social capital and how social capital could serve the crisis better. And then, of course, the final trend, which is on sort of digitization, right? Like switching to a digital way of doing business. It was a do or die situation because loan officers had very limited mobility, physical barriers were there. Every MFI considered moving towards greater operation, digital operations. And, in some cases, it was limited to chatbot digital disbursements, whereas in others, it was completely going digital. And throughout the entire life cycle of the customer interaction. So there in Africa, there's one MFI which used to have 18 in-person meetings for a JLG loan with the loan officer during the loan cycle. And now the MFI does only one pre-disbursement meeting. Everything else is done virtually. I think the premise of microfinance business as being a high-touch business is something for us to kind of discuss and sort of keep an eye on into the future. So when and if digital does take over, it could, change this premise significantly, not just from sort of impact of on the OPEX and cost structure, but also lead to unforeseen kind of movements in the demand supply, as well as, regulatory pulls that microfinance as a sector experiences. So let me just, I think with that, it will be good for us to shift to the panel discussion. So let me just stop screen sharing. I wonder, Anusha, if we could have the poll questions up again now.
We have already shared the polls now. So yeah, we can share the results, first questions results with you, yeah.
Great.
Is it showing?
Not yet.
Okay, I think the results are showing on live right now. It's not showing on our screens.
Okay. There's an information asymmetry there. We don't know.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I think so. That's fine. So what I would like to do is open up for discussions the remaining time that we have, and we also have, I think, towards the end some amount of time slotted for audience questions. So let me sort of quickly turn to the panelists. I will probably start with Deeparag. So I think this is a question about sort of dealing with the pandemic, right? The first wave and the second wave. This was, the initial moratorium announcement was in March, and at the time it was literally, it was just starting in terms of moratorium, and we didn't know what the sense was, what's going to kind of pan out over the several months after that. And then post the first wave subsiding, and it looked like economic activity was recovering, there was suddenly a full-blown sort of lockdown for the second wave, and there was a resolution framework 2.0. So I think question to you, Deepra, given that particularly because being an SFB, you also had deposit taking sort of permissions, which I think some of the other entities did not have. What was, what were the similarities and differences that you saw in how this affected you, how the pandemic or the lockdowns and the first and the second waves affected your borrowers? How did you, as an organization, respond in terms of immediately strategizing to manage this crisis? And how did you communicate, a lot of this to consumers and all of the schemes that the governments were, particularly on restructuring moratorium, let's not go into anything else, in a way that they could be understood and in a way that they could actually access the benefit of the scheme? So, Deepta, over to you.
Thank you, Deepti, and thank you, the Access Development Team, for this opportunity. So I think, Deepti, you kind of covered what you in your presentation, there being an information asymmetry in terms of this whole concept of lockdown, right? The pandemic, for the first time, I think globally there was this pandemic, but I think the commonality between both the waves, wave 1 and wave 2, were the sudden decisions of going into lockdown. Everybody knew that there is something of disruption coming, but for precautionary reasons, for the health scare that was there, but nobody knew when would a lockdown impose, especially during the first wave. I think the entire industry and India was caught with our guards down, and it was kind of sudden. It was like it broke a continuous chain of the entire economy, right? On the second wave, I don't say we were better prepared, but at least we knew the kind of disruptions that would have happened. But again, the point was nobody anticipated when would it strike. There was always this buzz that another wave is coming, and now there is a buzz around the third, right? So I think in both these cases, lockdown 1, lockdown 2, I think fundamentally what affected us, especially in Ujjivan and across the industry, is that areas, customers become inaccessible. Staff were available, but they were scared to go, and we were equally scared to send our staff out there, because this entire model that we have built in India in the micro finance sector is very person to person. It's a physical contact assisted model of banking, right? So the fundamentals of this entire model, I think, was challenged in both these lockdowns. So when the first lockdown happened, I think internally in Ujjivan, we were at the end of March. So thankfully, most of March recoveries and disbursements were over, but the last week of March, we had to do something around it, right? So what we quickly did, and we kind of acted on two fronts. One was internal, and another was external for the customer. So internally, I think we quickly had our treasury team. Being a bank, I think that gave us a little bit of cushion, and we had just raised our IPO before the pandemic, right? The bank had gone for its IPO before the pandemic. So in terms of capitalization, we were well capitalized. So there was a team that was formed internally to manage cash flows and to look at organizational liquidity. From the staff front, I think what we did was we formed a central QRT team, a quick response team, who would monitor the branches, the staff health across India. And just like most microfinance institutes, I think geographic diversification has been pushed for quite some time, and most of our operations are in areas where we never knew what is happening on the local level, and we had to, the QRT team had to kind of work together with the local authorities at different level to kind of ensure that the staff were aware of, in case of emergency, whom to approach, and we encouraged our staff to pass on the information to our customers. When it came to customers, I think even before we could talk about loans, repayment, whether you need fresh funding or not, I think customers were in no position, or they were the lack of information had caused a scare across, right? And so what we realized is, even before talking about financial behavior and everything, we need to ensure that our customers kind of get aware of what is the situation on ground, because we had a lot of announcements happening from the Ministry of Finance. We had a lot of announcements happening from the RBI, with the governor himself coming in and announcing several schemes. But translating those into what is the benefit for the end user, I think that was something that we worked upon. Uh, as part of both wave 1 and 2, I think we had an internal program called Janta Connect, and we clearly ensured that all our customers, all 4 million customers who were active borrowers at that time, we tried to reach out to them through regional language IVR, keep them updated on what what are the safety measures of COVID, gave them simple information. The quick response team was anyways getting what are the hospitals available, where can you get oxygen. So these basic details, if we try to pass on to our customers, and then follow it up with trying to simplify the kind of announcements and other things that were being made for these customers through Ministry of Finance, through the regulators, and try to simplify it for them. So what is moratorium? I think the word came for the first time in India, and there was a lot of questions of customers. So the IVR call, we found out that the IVR call was good because it was a one-way side of communication. We ensured that all our staff, who for the first time were never going out into the field, but they were operating from home, especially both in first lockdown for an extended period, for the second lockdown for a smaller period. I think making it easy to understand for our staff and to handle questions, we kind of did a quick training on basic questions that needed to be answered. In case a customer reaches out to you, who is eligible for moratorium, what is moratorium, what is the difference between moratorium and restructuring. These kind of things, we kind of encouraged our staff to kind of connect with them. And I think there was a push towards digital, but I think this was no longer a push. Just like Timon was a thrust towards digital, I think this was another more than a push. It's more like a shove towards moving into digital front altogether, right? So I think we tried to kind of give the staff as well a digital connect tool. So we kind of had all the customer registered mobile numbers with the bank, and with the help of a fintech company, we kind of set up an auto dialer for all the staff in their mobile phone, so that on the days of their repayment, now that we couldn't go and connect with the customers on the ground, we ensured that the staff could actually call out on those days and simply have discussions on what are the questions around them. There were questions on whether they will get a loan. There were questions on whether I will ever get my repayment back. And I think those were the basic steps that Ujjivan did at that time.
Great. So I think that brings us to the national next question, and I want to ask Vivek to kind of answer this. So really, it's about the thrust to digitization, right? And so we've heard that it certainly expedited the launch of digital interfaces. But did the situation actually prompt you to push for digitization in repayments and all of the other transactions that you may have, or did you already have strong guardrails in place? So that the business strategy itself was not as large a switch as people are thinking it to be. And have you been taking other measures since then to sustain the usage of digital services now that sort of normalcy has been established?
Thank you, Deepti. Definitely at Satya, from day one, the company was more focused towards paperless and cashless operations. Being as a new age institution, we have just completed 5 years, few days before. So it was comparatively, it was easier for us to adopt the new technologies and new changes on the ground. Satya was one of the first company who have crossed the benchmark of almost 500 crores of the digital collections from the ground. As of now, means we claim almost 95% of collections are digitized within 1 hour of the collections and like that. So, as a company, our birth was during the demonetization. That has pushed us towards digital collections and digital disbursements. Gradually, this pandemic was another big test for industry, for the company, and for the all the stakeholders, I can say. And when we have never thought in the past, because I'm in the microfinance field since last almost 20 years, and I have seen that how this model was almost too much personalized, and even the having the minimum MIS was there, all the documents were prepared just and the registers were there a few years before. And in last 5-7 years, almost everyone has pushed a lot to go digital. Sometimes we as an industry, we are competing with the fintech companies, you can say fintech companies on the ground, where we have a passion to reach to our customers in a least possible time. It was for many companies, it was a forced digitization. Even those who were comparatively big, it was difficult to train entire workforce in that particular time. But it was comparatively, it was very challenging time. Your offices are closed immediately. You are digitized, but your computers are in your offices. You cannot go to your offices. Your whole workforce is working on the ground, and they don't have any better way to connect. Means only mobile was the left option. Luckily, at Satya from day one, we have never purchased the desktops from day one. So that was comparatively a better position for us. All the loan officers, they were carrying the tablets with them from day one. So these, at least basic infrastructure was there at our end. And whatever the new developments were there from day one, as a company, we believe that we are not a technological innovators. We have to adapt the best possible technologies which are available to the nearby markets or to the peers or to banks or in the fintech industry, whatever the best we can adapt. And in last 2-3 years, means even conducting webinars and conferences like this in a digital mode 2 years before, means it was never thought. And I have seen that this conference was a very live conference, and it was a big, just like Kumbh Mela in Delhi. Every year we were meeting in Delhi. The personal touch, definitely it has impacted in some way, but digital has at least bridged that gaps, and we are able to meet the expectations, requirements, and continuous innovations are going on. Years before, means it was never thought that just by making a phone call or giving a QR code your customers, you can get your money back. And even without visiting the houses, you can ensure almost 60-65% your collections. Even I was just going by your Africa experience, where one MFI, they have decided in place of 18 meetings in a year, they will go by just one meeting, because out of that, another 15-17 meetings, they will conduct virtually or digitally. So these are the changes are there. And almost even the rural India is very much prepared for that. Definitely it is a force, it is a push is there, and everyone has understood the requirement. The new generations and the youngsters, they are quite innovative. The Facebook, WhatsApp, it has helped a lot in easy learning on the ground. And people are quite, almost 20 years before, when even the mobile was there, we were having a doubt that how the rural India will utilize it. And now you see that even some 500 crore ringtones are being sold every year. Just color tunes are being sold in the rural India. Just to that type of demand is there. So, definitely, we all don't have any option but to go digital, go paperless, go cashless. And what we have faced today, I think in next 2-3 years time, in next 5 years time, I think everything will be almost digital, and only some dinner parties and some cocktail parties will be physical. Other than everything will be, you can assume that most of the things are moving towards virtual and in a different way.
Okay, thanks, Vivek. So that's basically a do or die situation, like you described, but that you're also seeing that the future is not going to be what we're experiencing, what we experienced before the pandemic, not even what we're experiencing today. It's going to be even much more different. So on that note, quickly moving to Shashidhar. So I think, yeah, so, and then we come to the like this the extensive networks of BC correspondents that India has been building over the past decade or so. They are a crucial bridge to the most vulnerable sections of society to access formal and mostly bank accounts and transactions that it enables. And and immediately after the announcement of the lockdown, there was a surge in both volume and number of APS transactions. DBT is being distributed and withdrawn by customers. Volumes have seen a sustained pace since then. People have been, this is in some, and of course, not to say that there have not been issues, but there have been, but it's just that people have had to could access money and cope with the period of crisis thanks to this. And so in your case, and I know that Sabke is also in the business of credit intermediation, but I just wanted to speak about what it has been. Has the situation during the early stages of the lockdown, the first phases of the lockdown, how was it? What was the state of preparedness of the BC networks to deal? And I want you to speak to BC networks also in particular. How were they, able to manage the challenges of cash management, connectivity? You have to deal with the surge in volumes, and you also have this situation where new to payment customers are suddenly flocking, right? So what were some of the key measures and strategies that you as well as the BC industry itself took at this juncture, and how has the trajectory been over the following months since then?
Thank you, Deepti. Thanks to Access also for the opportunity. Yeah, so to your question in terms of how BC's dealt with this whole issue, obviously the first lockdown was quite chaotic, as you could imagine, because there is this whole definition of essential services and what do we really call an essential service. A BC agent also runs perhaps an essential service as a primary activity, but doing BC on the other side. Are they supposed to run BC, or should they be open only their Kirana shop? There were lots of these challenges. And clarity was lacking. Every state administration, sometimes district administration, is taking their own stand. So we had to really do a lot of work, not only at the institution level, but at the association level. BCFI has been very, very active in terms of seeking those clarifications. So there were multiple notifications that came from Home Ministry, and I think at some point the clarification were given that banking includes business correspondents and all that is considered essential. So about a month or so, a lot of uncertainty, law and order situations were there. Agents were being beaten up, because they were going to a bank branch for cash, but they were not allowed to move around. All that stuff happened, and of course, everybody was learning. The biggest challenge was the risk of infection, because the customers are flocking in because there is no other way to get the cash that is needed to survive, and agents were more exposed. So there was a lot of work that was done at that time. However, given that initial challenges, the real benefit started showing up when the DBTs were flown into the accounts. The Garib Kalyan Yojana as a big initiative that I think had BC agents not been around, or had they not been as active, I think it would have become a civil unrest in some sense, because there is money in the bank, but you can't take it towards a point. So a big success factor there is that more than 90% of these agents were kept open. They all learned the trick of the trade very quickly. Created their own environment of sanitation. They were, of course, to an extent reimbursed. Some banks started reimbursing costs, but all agents created their own way, of managing this crisis at their own front. And that they were at some point also recognized as Corona warriors by Finance Ministry, given the massive amount of reach that these people have actually made visible. I mean, they were already there, but it wasn't that visible. Even today, June 20 happens to be the month of the highest productivity at the agent level because of the rush of DBTs that came in and the month of full DBT activation. And of course, the numbers then again stabilized from there onwards. There were also challenges of banks being open for a substantial time to make cash available. Those aspects were also dealt with through a lot of lobbying and coordination at the association level. and things did stabilize at the end of the day, but it took time. It gave a lot of learnings for the second wave, I would say. Second wave was managed much more, in a better manner. There were localized, of course, actions, but there was more clarity. Circulars were more clear. Banking was more inclusive in the essential services declarations and all that stuff. So in that sense, it's a huge learning, but also it gave big impetus to the whole channel. People, as you just said, new to payment, new to bank. Well, not new to bank, but yes, new to payment customers have reached out to these agents. They now trust these agents more. The whole transaction volumes have overall gone up. The reliance on the agent networks have actually gone up. The network was put to test, but it was a good test because it helped the customers also and agents also in the run, in the medium run. So today we see a pretty stabilized kind of a situation, better than pre-COVID in terms of transactional volumes. But overall, there is a lot of balance that is now created. Bank branches became more conscious of the value that agents offer. And the overall, I think the composition of the network between branch and branchless, rather agents, is now much more valued across the customers and also the banking network. I think it's in some sense helped, but of course, without not devoid of its own challenges. So I'll just hold there. I do want to add that BCs do work on the asset side as well, but the challenges that mentioned by our colleagues are similar to what BCs have faced, excepting one fact that the new revelation or the realization for BCs is that credit risk is a real risk. And in a typical BC model, that was not really accounted in the equation as much as it should have been, because there is an FLDG factor associated with BCs, which is now put to severe test. And to surprise, BC balance sheets were put to test, which was not the premise of the model. And that has brought its own challenges. And of course, readjustments, and banks did cooperate a lot. And overall, I think this whole channel became more formidable, I would say. And future shocks, I'm sure, would be better managed, given the experience that we gained.
Okay. Thanks, Shashidhar. So I go back to Vivek, and we get into a little bit of the weeds, right? So particularly around data management, incorporating complexities because of the moratorium and confusions over credit reporting. All of these would have been unprecedented and unfamiliar. Measures would have had, added much more complexity to your data management process. So Vivek, what were some of the sort of workarounds that helped in introducing these new complexities seamlessly at your end?
Thank you, Dipti. I think you have touched a very relevant question, because my IT team was in too much pressure during that particular time. And even the IT team and vendors, they were not aware about the changes, and whatever was guided by the management during that time, we were bound to change after every 15 days or 20 days. How the credit bureaus is, the data will be reported to the bureaus. I think that was one of the biggest debate, because freezing the DPDs, that was never in the past. Means first time the moratorium was declared, and we were not very much aware that how we are going to collect the consent of the moratorium from our customers. That is first thing. And without their consent means how we can give them moratorium, and that can be reflected in the MIS, and that MIS will be reported to the bureau. That was one thing. Another thing, the LMS means changes in the LMS, and whether the interest will be charged or interest on interest will be charged, and what will be the right calculation. And after some time, means after too much debate and user cry, I think we were able to find as industry level some solutions, some consensus were there. And in the last, I think the worst thing was that when the government has declared some cases were there in the Supreme Court, and they have agreed to repay back the interest on interest, and government will pay government bear the cost of the interest on interest. And that interest on interest calculations and giving it back to the customers, freezing it properly in the data, and reconciliations and satisfying the auditors. That was, I think, in terms of quantum, you can say it was just a decision of 1 million or 2 million for entire industry, you can say hardly it was a decision of 10 to 15 million in total, I think. But on the other side, in terms of creating responsibilities and fixing it properly and claiming it with the government, means it has almost dealing with different stakeholders. It was another challenge. How we can develop relevant products during that particular time, how we can give a confidence to our customers that even other than the loans, we are there and our digital presence is there. That was another challenge. And MIS in nowadays means we are totally dependent on just on the servers, just on the data. And even 2 days before, there was some repairing in the server was going on in my office, and for 1 hour the server was was shut down. Almost there was a huge cry from the different field staffs, and I'm not able to check my bureau reports or something like that. So we have developed out too much dependency on the data, and how the data is interpreted and developed in the MIS. That is one thing. How you are going to explain it to your employees and customers on the ground, that was another one of the biggest challenge, means solving the technological requirements on the ground. That was definitely, it was not very easy, and development takes too much time and it has its own risk. And few companies, those who were having the in-house developments of the software, I think they were facing more challenges because they were learning more and they were implementing more, and the chances of risk was comparatively very high. The reputed vendors, they were getting the guidance from the banks, NBFCs, MFIs, and from all the nook and corners. Definitely, the similar pressure was there and similar solution was there for each and every institution. So, as a sector, definitely it was a tremendous pressure, and we are more socially and economically working on the ground, means whatever our actions are there, they speak loud on the ground and discuss on the ground. Even it is a matter of 10 rupees that is being discussed in large. So the data accuracy, I think for a few days, even I was very much worried that what we are communicating to our customers, whether is right or wrong, whether I'm going to lose my money because of we are not able to calculate the correct interest rates on the ground, or and reporting the credibility of a customer, means reporting it to the bureaus. That was another one of the biggest challenge. And when during the first moratorium, when the moratorium was declared, almost it was till August. And there was a court going on, there was a case going on in the Supreme Court, and it was till September even, that was uncertainty was there, whether they are going with different verdict or they will come with some different solutions, and how the court decisions will be implemented in the MIS again, means it was not very easy. But I would like to congratulate the IT team of entire sector and entire banking and finance industry, that they have managed it very beautifully. And what we are able to survive today because of our finance team, because of our IT team during that particular time, and definitely operations team, business team, they are also always foot soldiers on the ground. But the relevance of IT during pandemic, I think it was, we all have visualized that. And even until unless it was not audited by some third party, I was not confident that whether the final data is correct or final numbers are being calculated. And the industry was going by some weekly collections and weekly interest accruals. It is shifted to daily interest accruals, and even after closing of the month, then capitalization of the interest. We have never seen in the past. It was not very easy, but as industry we have learned, and during the second wave, it was easy to manage. But first wave, it was not easy. This time there is a PCG scheme is going on, personal credit guarantee scheme is going on, where you have to lend 2% lower to your normal rates. At the same time, you are dealing with 2 or 3 different products on the ground. And to which customers you have to give the PCG loans, to which customers you have to give the normal loans, and confusion between the rates on the ground. It was earlier within the institutions. Now it is between the customers now going on, even in the same set of the group. The people are getting to differentiate the interest rates on the ground. To meet all these expectations, these are not very easy. But positive thing is that such things make the industry more mature and more responsible, and it brings more capacity on the ground, and we become more prepared for the future. Even during this challenging time, we are able to innovate more and find much better solutions during tough times.
Great. Very, very interesting insights. Vivek. So I just want to switch to Deeparag. And Deeparag, if we can, talk a little bit more about loan restructuring itself, right? So there was the resolution framework announced first in August 2020, and then in May 2021, we had the resolution framework 2.0. Both these frameworks allow for restructuring of loans to borrowers who met certain eligibility criteria. Institutions had the freedom to formulate board-approved policies to identify which borrowers with a proven track record and who were distressed solely due to COVID could actually avail the resolution plan. So all of these would have led to, or rather would require complex identification and verification, deciding what's the kind of algorithm, if I may say, or decisioning tree that you would use in order to identify which households you want to, or who deserve restructuring or not. So how did you manage this whole restructuring process, and what were the practices that you adopted in your organization, which you can share?
Right. So Deepti, I think while the sentences that were circulated are always simple, but the interpretation of these sentences become really difficult. And I think Vivek sir just now referred to what kind of confusion and what kind of day-to-day surprises were kind of jumping up from all parts, because managing all our books are kind of decision is done by credit, and then there is an IT system. So the credit decisioning angle had to be simplified. The IT team had to kind of reconfigure the loan management system in order to kind of keep up with all these changes, right? So I think in Ujjivan, what we fundamentally did was to ensure that customer interests are protected, and whatever step we do, it's easy for our staff to explain. So those were two fundamental things based on which we kind of took our decisions on how to implement RF1, RF2, Moratorium 1, and then the subsequent extension of moratorium, right? So if I were to take a step back, I think just before the first wave of pandemic, there was a section in Eastern India which was also kind of distressed by Amphan. There was a cyclone in Bengal and Odisha. So I think we already had a significant portfolio in Odisha and Bengal which was affected. And then the lockdown kind of compounded it. So what we did was in Moratorium 1, we communicated that all customers who have paid their EMI in March will get moratorium for the remaining months. But if any customer has not paid in March, they will still get covered. So that kind of was a clear communication to all our staff on the ground. When it came to Moratorium 2, by that time, I think in some pockets, lockdown had been lifted. There were restart of some kind of business activity and all. I think at that time, again, we gave customers a choice. And like I said, I think that Janta Connect program that we had done, where every month we were calling out customers, our entire credit team. So we have an independent credit team who assesses this decision centrally. So that credit team started engaging sets of occupation to see which occupations are kind of reviving faster compared to others, and who might need assistance and who might not need assistance. So there was a study done with over 4 lakh customers within the different set of around 70 major occupations that we normally lend to within both group loan and individual loans put together. And I think based on that, we had a framework that Moratorium 2 was given on a month-on-month basis only to customers who did not pay EMI. Okay. At the end of moratorium period, when RF1 came in, I think we were very clear again, saying that customers were offered EMI skip or reduction in EMI, both options. that were given under RF1. And in order to do this, at that time, we could not innovate. We were trying something on a digital front. But for RF1, we went out and took physical consent of customers. I think Vivek sir just mentioned in his piece that getting consent was a huge task, because there has to be an audit trail for future audit that this customer has really requested for it, right? And it could not be a back-end system where you just give it en masse and kind of move your book forward. So we had to do with a physical consent of customers. And if the customers who opted for EMI reduction, we had to do interest capitalization and move forward. And accounts that were provided RF1, our IT team had to build a separate flag for it in our loan management system, so that future performances, future reporting, everything is kind of tracked for these accounts. Okay. We managed a sizable portion. We managed close to around 3 lakh odd customers out of our to go for RF1 through this entire process. RF2, which was much more recent, based on our current lockdown 2, I think by that time we had learned a lot. And this time around for RF2, we again went back to customer consent. But learning from RF1, I think we did not go for a paper-based process this time. And like I said, there was a push towards digital, right? So we ensured that through the registered mobile numbers, we could generate an OTP and customers could give a call back and request. We brought in biometric while there was fear around the devices being used again and again, but biometric consent for at least, instead of signing documents and all, for our segment of customer, even the signatures are not common, right, across all paperwork. So we decided why not move into the biometric way and kind of take consent through thereof, right? And the entire approval process post that was digitized compared to the first time around, when post RF1 consent, we evaluated and then gave out a bid. So I think that made it easier. And by the time we had RF2, I think ECLGS, one of the schemes that that had been announced, were also available, and the ECLGS scheme seemed to be quite popular among the customers who were taking restructuring under RF2. In terms of credit policies directed to make it simple for staff, I think we were very clear that we had stopped NCA across, right? And we only wanted to concentrate on repeat customers with good track records and encourage customers to kind of, if they were able to pay, continue. If they were not able to pay, they encourage them to kind of restructure their loan so that their record and all does not get affected. But this was, I think, in mid October, November, by the time we had seen some kind of business resumption start happening. I think other than this, selected geographies, we had relaxation in our own internal credit norms and all. So I think one of our very fundamentals of selecting a customer was a house visit, which is pretty common across the industry, right? So for the first time, we tried tele-verification, and that has been kind of a best practice that has been brought in post this COVID, where we can do a tele-verification or even move towards video PD. So those are the kind of things that we kind of did to manage restructuring and reporting around it.
Great. So that's a lot of detail, and I think that's very, very important to understand for the audience, right? And for onlookers to understand. What does it really take for institutions on the ground to roll with the tide? So I just want to quickly ask Shashi, based on at the vantage point that where you are and what you see in the sector, are there, any examples of product innovation or process innovation that you would that the pandemic necessitated, but which you think really stood out for you, and and I suppose, as an industry observer, would love to hear what you have to say about this, because it's what we heard so far is really what Ujjivan as well as Satya Micro Capital have done. So anything that you want to talk about?
Certainly. I would touch on the lending side first. So there, I think the scope for innovation is much more. Payments, we know that UPI as a rail has actually helped a lot in terms of enabling a lot of digitization. But on the lending side, of course, we enable mostly microfinance, but also to an extent MSME for banks. In that process, actually what happened for us as a BC and a kind of aspiring fintech journey, we reimagined the whole microfinance in a digital environment much before COVID has hit us. And we were sort of preparing ourselves to experiment on that idea. In fact, it was purposefully termed as a remedy, in some sense, to remedy the long-standing microfinance high-touch model, reimagining microfinance in digital environment with a different spelling. And we kind of were more or less ready with a concept note and the product note and everything, and were about to experiment. And COVID happened. We just, realized that the flow has to be reversed because the collections became the biggest pain point. And in that frame, we very quickly implemented some of the thoughts that we had in the remedy, but on the collection side. As Vivek and I think their companies have taken lead in terms of demonstrating that that is really possible. We took a step ahead and said, let's see if customers can actually do it themselves. So self-initiated digital payments through apps and QR codes and things like that. So that journey for us has actually taught a lot of lessons, especially in the fact that microfinance customers are all not one block. There are a lot of them that are evolving into more digitally savvy. And in fact, the demographics of microfinance customers is also becoming younger and younger, which means that there are more digital natives that are coming into the microfinance space. And today, as we speak, 15% of our customers actually pay their regular EMIs themselves without a touch point, rather. So, it's possible to imagine what an African MFI example that you quoted, at least for these 10-15% customers, which in Indian context is very, very large, right? So the idea is that if we can enable these customers to come in digitally on the payment side, which obviously is a high touch, high risk, as well as high pain point, now digitizing on the other side of the journey would be perhaps conceivable, right? So we innovated on the payment side quite a bit and rolled out many possibilities, apps, QR codes, agent networks, and many such variations. And now we are trying to also use digital channels for monitoring. So there is a field monitoring that is happening right from various offices that people are, because travels are restricted. So we have opened up digital monitoring mechanisms. Customer interactions are happening digitally, especially collections and group meetings. And now the idea is to come in and see if some customers can onboard themselves on the other side. So those experiments are on. So what happened is the COVID has sort of reinforced that thought, which we were anyway trying to build out, but we would have taken probably a longer time to bring all that together. In COVID environment, that time wasn't there. So the urgency has become multiplied, right? So in some sense, it helped innovation. It, of course, brought its own challenges. But from a positive note, I think a high time that microfinance need to be reimagined in a digital environment. And there are a set of customers, I would say lakhs of them, if not millions, who are ready to fly. And if we don't take care of them, like friends are saying, fintechs are coming, right? So whether you serve them or you lose them, I think we should that way be conscious of the fact that digital awareness among customers and the demand for convenience is growing. Not many customers are probably ready to go through the whole structured system of microfinance models that have survived for so long. And that realization, I think, is coming in many of us and trying to test this case. Pre-COVID, we did all this for MSME customers. We thought MFI customers were not ready. But COVID has taught us that actually MFI customers are also ready, at least a portion of them. So that is where I think the real innovations also will continue to happen. And we are doing our part.
Okay, wonderful. So I think all three of the panelists have, I think, broadly aligned with what the audience also feels. For example, I'm sure the audience has seen the poll results, but particularly in relation to digitization, we have two questions. One is, has digitization led the way for reimagining? Sorry, let me just go to the first one. Reimagining the microfinance business model, and we had, I think, 94% saying it generated new income streams, and the rest 6% saying digital has no demand in rural areas. And the other question was on whether digitization of operations has led the way for. Sorry, I think we had, I can't remember what the question was, but we had three options. Digital has no demand. It generates new income. Oh, sorry, wait. I think there are. I suppose these results, and I'm guessing the results that I'm talking are really the final ones, that 57% felt it generated new income streams, and 42% felt it did not generate income streams, but it has significant cost savings and efficiency gains. So I think that's established for all of us. So quickly moving tracks, we're going to switching tracks. We're going to talk about policy measures that were introduced to boost liquidity. And so I think this is a question. I think first I'll come to Deeptarag and then we'll come to Vivek. But the question is to understand, a slew of relief measures were announced. The PCGS is obviously continuing, but other than the TLTRO, the ECLGS scheme, the partial credit guarantee scheme, the coverage of interest on interest by the government of India for loans less than 2 crores. So, and I think special liquidity support for MSMEs and for I think microfinance entities. From your and I think the response has been mixed in terms of usefulness and uptake of the scheme. It worked for some, it didn't work for many. From your experience from your own experience at your organization and of what's been happening in the sector, which schemes were proved most beneficial for you for boosting liquidity, and for you as opposed to for the entire microfinance system itself? So was there any trends or practices that emerged in terms of how entities were using these schemes or not? So Deeptarag, if you could go first, and then we'll come to Vivek.
Yeah, I'll start off with a disclaimer that I might have a biased view, and because unfortunately, a lot of these schemes that were announced was beneficial to bank, right? And as an industry as a whole, I think there was space wanting for somebody who is lending but is dependent on debt from somewhere else, or is trying to raise equity. I think the market was not favorable, and I think a lot of policies could have been made in that direction. But coming to Ujjivan specifically, I think what was surprising was that Ministry of Finance and the regulator was really accommodative during this period, right? And the kind of interactions that we had seen during our MFI days versus an SFB day, and I can kind of make that comparison. I think we got a lot of ear of the regulator this time around, and a lot of policies that kind of happened was kind of in line with what we were wanting or kind of discussing, right? The fact that the RBI governor met SFBs and banks and others several times, gave repeated assurance, kind of made an enabling policy framework, if I were to call it that. So several things that worked for us, I think, and like I said, I'll be biased because we were well capitalized even just prior to the pandemic, right? So things that worked for us during this, I think the bringing down of the borrowing rates. So SLTRO, which was specifically launched for SFB, I think that one policy helped us a lot in terms of managing our long-term capital. Reserve ratios for banks had been brought down, which was additional, I think, for the SFBs and banks. They were relooked. And I think the most benefit that our customers got was through the ECLGS, because a government-backed loan program was the demand of the hour, and I think that came out, right? And I think with all these means there was a sense of relief, but at the same time, I think there were a lot of initiatives done by the DFIs, which is SIDBI, NABARD, and they also came together to announce few schemes, right? So if I were to talk Ujjivan, I think the two programs that I would really appreciate during this period would be the SLTRO for SFBs and ECLGS that was aimed for customers.
Okay. Vivek, if you could talk of the unique challenges that your industry faced, because that experience will be different from what banks have experienced. So over to you.
Thank you, Deepti. Thank you, Deeptarag. You have tried to share the challenges and opportunities during that particular time. I think just after the lockdown, MFIs were in too much stress. The moratorium was declared by the Reserve Bank of India. It was passed to the almost 100% customers immediately because we were not having any choice, and we were not allowed to move on the ground for almost 2 to 3 months during that particular time. So almost the collections were not possible during that particular time. But when it comes to the lenders, almost hardly 50% lenders, they have agreed to pass the moratorium to the institutions. And whatever the capacity was left means with the institutions, it was toughest time, whether we have to pay the salaries first and meet the emergency requirement of our customers, those who are having the medical emergencies during that time. Otherwise, I have to pay the EMIs on our loans, and even in some cases where the NCDs were foreign NCDs where they were just about to mature during that particular time, and a lump sum repayments were expected that particular time. If I think first 3-4 months they were, I think it was just do or die, or you can say that whether we are going to survive by July or not. That was one. But and within the industry, the position was different for many institutions. The big institutions, they were comfortable because of their lending relationships and capital adequacy ratios. The mid-sized institutions, you can say 500 plus to some 500 plus crores institutions, they were in comparatively comfortable. It was not comfortable, but they were in stress zone, but they were able to manage. They were borrowing at higher rates during that particular time, and they were trying to survive and meet the expectations of the lenders during that time. I think that was. But the small size institutions, those who were below 500 crore, you can say below 250 crores, they were, I think, worse affected, paying the salaries, whether they will do the layoff first, they will pay the EMIs first, or how they will survive. It was almost very difficult. And because of this pandemic, you can see that there are at least 8-9 institutions are there. They are still struggling to survive. Almost 20% in terms of numbers, they will be surviving, or their merger and acquisitions will be more in the sector. But no one is going to. There are limited appetite to buy the institutions, even they are available at reasonable cost. That is still there, and they are still struggling. All the TLTRO 1 or 2 or this partial credit guarantee schemes that was exhausted to the almost big players only. The smallers, they have struggled. We have created almost smaller players through MFIN, through Sadhan. We have created our voices at different levels, but I think those who are having the powers, only they can survive in the financial industry, and especially the capital is going to be the key driver in every scenario. Means if you are having capital adequacies at a comfortable level, everyone is going to lend you, and you must be having a negative carry in your books. But there are a number of institutions, those who are struggling on the ground, those who are having good process, system, governance, control, everything, but no one is going to support them during that particular time. Till last 2 years, industry has faced several challenges in terms of crisis during in terms of liquidity, but I think it's still the good institutions, they were able to raise the capital during that particular time. Even at Satya, we were able to raise some 35 millions during the pandemic time, at the peak of the pandemic, and we were the first institution who have raised the capital that particular time, and it was at reasonable valuations. So we were lucky enough, but not everyone was there, and everyone was not having the supportive investors at that particular time. Even I know the 4 or 5 institutions who were having the agreed term sheets, and the expected closings were almost in the month of last days of March or April. It has extended, and in some cases it has never happened. The liquidity, the fresh disbursements from in the month of March, we generally expect higher disbursements in the month of March, and everyone was in an aggressive mode to grow the businesses by till 15th March or so. And whatever the limited liquidity they were having, they have exhausted because they were expecting some significant cash flows will come in coming days. But it was pandemic, and lenders and investors, they have their own way of supporting the sectors. When the things are normalized, only then they want to put the money. When there is instability in the market, definitely it becomes difficult. Even in our case, means we don't want to lend when the some storm is going on in the field. So definitely the challenges were there, but I think we all have learned more in this particular crisis, how to diversify in terms of our geographies, how to diversify in terms of our lenders, and in terms of our investors. I think that was the key learning during this pandemic time. As if you have a significant portfolio in a particular pocket, some political issues have happened in the Assam, some movements have happened in the Punjab, some Kisan movements was going on during that particular time. So every time, I think whatever is happening in the socio-economic framework, microfinance is the first that is going to answer all such questions first. Means in terms of, no one is going to ask once what there is a farmers movement is going on in Punjab, and it is going to hamper in any way to the banks because they are having a different products. It is our collateral free loans are there, microfinance its own difficulty, challenges, and opportunities. But I am very much optimistic that the investors have started coming back again, and almost 13 or 14 institutions, they have raised capital in last 1 year time. So already those who are able to, valuations are sacrificed, they are being negotiated hard, but I think the raising the capital at a reasonable price, that is, I think, very much important, and everyone is trying to do that. And in my personal opinion, microfinance is one of the most opportunity, the sector with full of opportunities and full of possibilities there, and the resilience is quite strong in this sector. So definitely those who will be able to survive, they will see good days in coming years, and sector will bounce back again, and it will grow many folds from here. Means whatever the learnings during the pandemic are there, they are there, but investors definitely, they are going to back the good institutions again. Market is full with liquidity, they are sitting at a huge money, so definitely they will support good institutions. It is now our turn, how we are able to position ourselves in terms of our process, system, governance, controls, and appetite to grow. And that is going to decide the market. Definitely NABARD, SIDBI, and all other institutions, they have supported in a different way. Even Mudra, we were expecting to support them in a different way, and that is bank for the almost sectorial bank is there.
So Vivek, if I may ask one more question in this regard, and just give me a one-line answer. What was your overall strategy? Would you describe it as you were conserving cash and you were careful about expanding book, or was it that you saw this as an opportunity? What would you describe that strategy in the line?
Dipti, first we decided to sit at a liquidity of at least 3 months. Means if there is a zero collection from the field, at least we should have 100 days liquidity in our hand to pay all our obligations, especially salaries and EMIs first. Means even we are having zero disbursements on the ground, we wanted to sit at 3 months liquidity in our cells. That was one. Definitely that has increased, and careful lending was there, but conservation of cash has increased. Yeah, that is there.
So same question to actually, Shashi and Deepta, like if you want to describe what was your overall strategy in terms of cash management, I wouldn't say cash management, fund management, what would that be?
Go ahead.
Shashi, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I think conserving cash was definitely one of our priorities. And I think more than lending and lending to the right kind of customers, we were looking at areas to improve operational efficiency. So the last question that you asked to Shashi in terms of what has digital done for us, I think we tried to remap all our processes in a digital journey so that more than customer acquisition, it brings in operational efficiencies for us to kind of save costs, at least in the medium to long term.
Yeah, just to add, BCs were in a different situation because typically BCs don't plan a lot of liquidity in their business because that's not the nature of business, right? It's more a
Right.
model. And when lockdowns happened, when collection stopped, then your revenue is directly impacted, and that kind of creates the whole vicious cycle of lack of runway for the rest of the period. So in BCs don't rely on debt capital because it's not the business that will run on debt. So mostly it's funded by either equity or promoters' money, and funded by banks in terms of service fees. So this whole cycle of lack of collections, increasing NPA, hitting FLDGs, invocation of FLDGs, created a very, very serious stress on BC's balance sheets. In fact, as I said, it has put to a test the whole model itself. Good thing is several banks have come to rescue, and they have reconstructed the payout models, or they have allowed a longer tenure for FLDG settlements, or they've advanced some cash to BCs to manage their operations. Because it's like, we are joined at the hip. You have to manage operations and to ensure collections and all. But the two bouts of lockdowns have created a serious stress on the cash flows and the ability to manage the show. Nevertheless, of course, running operations was critical to BCs and continued to be so. So there is continuing to be a bit of a back and forth with banks in terms of how do you compute FLDGs, how do you define the whole obligations, how do you share the risk. I think these questions are coming up much more than before because many BCs have first time faced a situation where you have a full exposure and which probably your balance sheets would not have been planned to support. So that's kind of a work in progress today. Lots of effort is being made in terms of making this more sustainable model going forward as well, given the reality of the risk that now is growing in the sector.
Okay, so we are slowly moving towards the end segment of this discussion, and here I would really like us to think about third wave preparedness. And I'm sorry to be, I don't want to be like a doomsday sayer, but really, I think the second wave has subsided. Vaccinations have been going on in full swing. The festival season is behind us. And yet there is this fear of a third wave. Of course, the third wave may not result in mortality like it was experienced in the second wave. But and I know you touched upon all of this, all of the kind of best practices that the past year has taught you, right, in being prepared for crisis situations that may hit at any time. So maybe if you could talk about, what business strategy level shifts are here to stay for good. We did discuss sort of digitization as well as I think process re-engineering to a more digital framing. But we are also, there I think two things which are in the horizon, and I know that there is another panel which to take that on and do justice to that theme. But we have the RBI. We are expecting the RBI to place the final guidelines on microfinance regulations, where they're trying to streamline what microfinance is and not moving away from an entity to an activity type definition. So that's one, and the other is the new digital lending report report of the RBI Committee on Digital Lending, where it questions the FLDG premise, right? If you have third-party providers who are offering last mile delivery capabilities, and who provide FLDG, and like Shashi had talked about, that it tested the balance sheets when some of these guarantees were called upon. What do you think? So these are, I think, two big ticket, possibly sector changing themes that are on the horizon. So I want to go maybe with Vivek first, and then Deeptarag, and then Shashi. Just tell me, like, what are the strategic shifts that you're seeing in this business? And we'll take it from there.
Definitely, the third wave means the worry is there, and during first two waves we have learned a lot till now, but still no one is prepared. Means I can say that because positive thing is that the vaccination is there, and the impact may be comparatively low. The Omicron virus is still being evaluated in different parts of the world, and still there is no concrete theories there. Some people are saying that it is going to replace the Delta virus. It will be less mortal. I think just one death has been reported till now. But as a industry and as a company, means I can say from the both side, means definitely the most concrete thing is that the customers' behavior on the ground, how we are going to choose better customers on the ground, and how we are going to redesign our pre-disbursement process, where it is fairly a disbursement in place of distribution. Sometimes microfinance go by distributing the loans in different villages. How we are going to ensure proper credit culture and identifying better customers on the ground, that is going to be the first thing. And in that particular mode means we have already invested too many things on the ground, and mainly in digital mode. Basically the disbursements were taking place at the branches only, and sometimes it is that they are not allowed to come at the branches. So most of the companies, they are shifting to the field disbursements and how to control the loan agreements. E-signature will be I think that will be another adaptation, I think, in coming days. And at Satya already we have crossed some 2 lakh customers. They have 2 lakh loans they have already given through the e-sign till now. So the paperless and cashless, definitely, that I have discussed earlier, that is going to lead the sector. But innovations in terms of insurance products, that will come, and how the loan products, some flexi loan products, or we can design something, some products where there are repayment holidays during the pandemic time, but how it will be treated in the books and in different scenarios. I personally am not able to find the answer till now, but creating pressure on your staffs and customers during difficult days, if you are setting a comfortable liquidity, we have to find some flexi loan products on the ground, where they are having some flexibility to not pay during difficult days, or something like pandemic or Amphan, or something is going when something beyond the control is there, natural calamities are there. That maybe some more innovations are required on the ground, another insurance products, digital adaptations, and more digital transactions, and training to the customers, and creating more awareness, and also how the frauds can be minimized on the ground. Because when everything is going digital, then the chances of frauds are very high, and how the customer awareness will be there in that particular segment, that is going to be the key challenges. But definitely it will strengthen the industry, and we will become more mature.
Great. Thank you, Vivek. Deeptarag, we can also talk about industry shifts, strategic shifts, even in the context of SFBs, and not just your organization. That will be great.
Okay, first and foremost, I think Vivek sir has kind of spoken about the entire industry. There's very little differentiation between the SFBs that are still pursuing microfinance versus the regular the NBFC MFIs, right? So there, if I were to talk about the SFBs, there are clear SFBs who have kind of moved on from the segment and are moving into much more individual, direct kind of approach with customers. But within the microfinance space, if I were to see, I think one of the biggest changes would be moving from this assisted model of banking to making sure that the customers are there on a self-service kind of a mode, right? And one of the things I think that Shashi brought out in his discussion also, there's a significant percentage of customer that we see who have during this pandemic started not going to the traditional center meetings that the industry thought were the only collection points, but have started servicing their own debts either through a mobile app or through UPI, the entire UPI network that has been created, Google Pay, Phone Pay, and others, or walk into a nearby BC point and service their loan through the AEPS network, right? So customers have started showing behaviors that in order to preserve themselves, they choose not to go to a crowded place, but to do banking at their convenience. And I think as a industry, we should start respecting that, or otherwise we will lose out on a set of early adopters who might eventually let us redefine or redesign this entire lending process that we have today. So I think internally in Ujjivan, we are trying to think of a self app, right? Self-serving app, which is in local language, which has video and audio spoken back in local language. And customers can, and it is integrated with all these various payout points, so that whenever a customer chooses to take a loan, they just click a request for a loan based on their occupations and histories. That the other good thing that this pandemic has brought us, and maybe one of the good things from a lender's perspective, is the credit history has been severely tested, and there is a significant segment who has stood the test of time, and that I think is the resilience that the industry has shown, right? So based on this, I think moving out of this occupation-based cycle-wise lending, if we can actually move into a scorecard-based lending, maybe that is something from a lending front that we would love to explore and give the right kind of loans. Why? Means the fundamental question is, why should a customer who comes first time to one bank or one institute get loan what the institute had decided for their credit, internal credit guidelines? Why not recognize their capabilities both in good times and bad times and give them appropriate loans? And finally, I think in terms of product innovation, other than the lending innovation, I think there will be a interesting dynamic. A lot of people in the industry are now moving away from a traditional term loan into an OD kind of a product, right? So overdraft, especially with in the SFB segment, because you have an account out there, and based on their transactions, based on what kind of, if everybody is trying to give a QR code, link it to their account so that they can monitor the level of transaction, especially in the business segment. Why not, instead of giving them a term loan, why not give them an OD and let them utilize that OD? So that is something which is very interesting that might come out, hopefully pre-third wave, and let's keep our fingers crossed that there's no third
I think
wave.
the OD is $1 million question. I think everybody's across jurisdictions have been discussing the potential for a product like this, and it waits to be seen who's going to be the first mover on that. So Shashi, quickly closing remarks. What was your take on? Of course, we don't want to get into a full discussion of the FLDG problem, but what are the big strategic shifts that you're foreseeing?
So I think apart from all the digital discussion we had, the biggest question that I think MFIs will now have to answer is about the risk management systems.
Right.
I think we were not ready, and our model doesn't actually account for a very strong risk management framework, because it's a very machine run kind of a model. Now the things have been disrupted, and we need to be more ready to accept the fact that different customers will behave differently to different shocks, and whether we are ready to reskill our people to be able to manage that situation on the ground. Do we have the right data analytic capabilities to assess and predict the risk that will come in the forthcoming waves or whatever, even without waves, I think the situation has changed now. The market is not the same. So I think to me, the strategic shift is how MFIs will see the risk management systems going forward, apart from all the other things that we talked about.
Great, wonderful. So I think this has been a stellar session. I think let me just wrap this up, but key learnings, I think big ticket trends that I'm picking up from this, other than digitization, is also process re-engineering, which has now become a significant bread and butter kind of an activity. And it certainly wasn't like what life was before. The asset balance sheet, not even balance sheet, but I think the asset-led BC model and really that third-party providers with last mile capabilities is now suddenly coming into the foray. There has been increasing recognition of their role and how to make life, I think, at least slightly easier for them. There has been an overwhelming recognition of the finance and compliance teams as well as the tech teams for having really braved the pandemic, and they really, and not to say that this diminishes the contributions of the business teams, but this is, there is tremendous recognition for the role that they have played. And I feel like the last but not the least, we are, I think, well placed to see strategic shifts in the manner in which lending to the last mile, small ticket lending, or to lower income households is going to change, hopefully for the better, and moving away from what I think Deeparag described as occupation or cycle-based lending to a scorecard-based model. So let's see how that's going to pan out. I think the most important, I feel like, is what Shashi mentioned, which is that focus on risk management is going to come back. While so far the banking system was riddled with the lack of focus on risk management for the banking sector, I think it's great that the non-banking sector is really pushed to think about this problem and to find solutions for it proactively. So I think on that note, I would like to extend a fantastic, thank you so much, the big gratitude for having contributed so openly to all of the panelists, and we look forward to future conversations on the many themes that have come up so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all the panelists for being a part of this really interesting discussion, and thank you especially Deepti for a very effective moderation. So we would conclude the session over here. To everyone who has joined us online, we'll be taking a 5-minute break and we'll be resuming with the next technical session, the second one of the track. It's called Beyond the 3 Decades, New Pathways for the SHG Movement. We'll be back in 5 minutes in Hall A itself. So see you there.